Hi, thanks for clicking on this video. My name's Tim Jay. I'm a Professor of Psychology of Education at the Centre for Mathematical Cognition, Loughborough University. So this video is part of the Loughborough University Mathematics Education Network's collection of resources around research in mathematics learning. So I'm going to be talking about parental engagement in mathematics learning. It's an area that I've been researching in and working in for a little over 10 years now, and that's involved studies working with children and parents and teachers, thinking about how we can improve parental engagement and ultimately improve children's mathematics learning. So in this video, I'm going to talk about three things. It's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, fitting 10 years of research into a 40-minute video. And if there are parts of this that you're particularly interested in and want to take further, I've included some references in the slides, but also feel free to get in touch with me at the university. So I'm going to talk about why mathematics at home is important. Why should we care about what children are doing when they're not in the classroom as far as their mathematics learning goes? And then I'm going to talk about why don't some parental engagement interventions work? If we know it's an important thing and we know we should be trying to improve it, why have we not had much success so far? And then finally, what can work? So I'm going to talk about some of the work that we have done to think differently about parental engagement and think about how we can support good parental engagement in ways that do work by taking a different approach to some traditional ways of developing parental engagement in schools. So first of all, why is out of school mathematics important? I'm going to just clarify a little bit here that most of the research that I've done in this area has been with relatively younger children. So from early years, so reception class, up to around 7-8 years old. I think this is the area that I've understood most about with parental engagement. And my feeling is that parental engagement probably is more important for that age group than, say, secondary school age children, where first of all the maths gets more difficult, so parents aren't always able to help in the same way. Also, there's more parents aren't quite so involved in the day-to-day activity of what children do, and also children are expected to be a little bit more independent in their learning by secondary school. So I am talking about younger children and as I say, I've worked with children and parents and teachers where children are around reception age, so from around 4 up until around 8 years old. So I think the same principles probably go for children a little outside that age range, but not a long way outside that age range, I would suspect. Okay, but all that being said, why is out of school mathematics important? So first of all, research tells us that maths talk strongly predicts achievement. So what do I mean by that? So here's an example of a couple of different studies that have focused on out of school mathematics talk. And they really just do mean that. By maths talk, it's any talk that involves number words, or other words around uses of number in language. So Susan Levine and colleagues in 2010, they were looking at the amount of talk between mothers and their children that included number words from 1 to 10. They also looked at other uses of words like count, like how many, like number. And they were looking at mothers with children aged between about 14 and 30 months old. So one key thing to note from that study is that there was a huge amount of variation in the amounts of number talk that they observed in different families. So there's some families using very few. So they saw, in the families where there was the least maths talk, there were 4 instances of number words and related words in their recordings. But in families where there was the highest level, there were 257 instances. So there's a really big range of quantity, frequency of number words in mothers and children's talk. And then in parental elicitation of children's number talk, this is like questions that parents could answer. So parents asking children to count, asking questions like how many. In some families, there were 0 examples of parent elicitations of child number talk, and in some families, there were 30. So big variation. So a similar study in the example below, Suspirigai and Davis-Keene, they recorded 4 hours of talk at meal times with a whole group of families where children were aged 4 to 5 years old, so slightly older than in the LUMEN study. And again, they saw quite similar results. They saw between 4 examples, 4 instances of maths talk across that 4-hour period, up to, in the most maths talk speaking families, they had 195 instances. So what's that? About 50 instances of maths talk per hour, compared to 1 in the least frequent households. So similar levels of variation in the two, which tells us something about the reliability of these data. So my question at the bottom of the slide there is, does this matter? Would I be asking that question if it didn't? Yes, it does matter. So in both of those studies, the researchers followed up those same children sometime later to see how their mathematics achievement, their mathematics learning was going. And in both cases, they found that the volume of number talk, when they recorded that in the first phase of the research, was strongly correlated with number knowledge sometime later. So Susan Levine had followed up her participants 16 months later. Suspirigai and Davis-Keene followed up their participants 1 year later, and both found that the children that experienced the most mathematics talk, with their mothers, when that was recorded, had the highest levels of number knowledge or mathematics ability in the second phase of the research. And similar research is being done in early education settings too. So I think, again, a research team involving Susan Levine measured number talk during circle time in early years rooms, and found that the classrooms where there was a higher amount of number talk and maths talk in circle times led to higher levels of mathematics achievement at the end of the year. And they were able to factor out the possibility that teachers' decisions to use mathematics talk might be dependent on children's initial levels of maths ability, and found that teachers' use of maths talk was not correlated to levels of mathematics ability or achievement at the beginning of the year, but it was highly correlated to maths achievement at the end of the year, suggesting that the causal direction is more maths talk leads to higher levels of achievement. So we've got fairly good evidence that the more maths talk that children are exposed to or involved with or included in, the better their mathematics achievement at a later date. So we also know that generally higher levels of parental engagement lead to higher levels of achievement. So this is more generally than maths talk. Quite a lot of governments around the world, one way or another, are committed to increasing levels of parental involvement in children's education. So sometimes this is actually enacted legally. So in Scottish schools, it's a legal requirement for schools to have a parental involvement strategy. In other in other parts of the world, it's in guidance of one form or another. And a lot of the government advice on parental involvement stems from some large-scale correlational studies showing associations between various forms of parental involvement in children's education and children's attainment on assessments at primary and secondary school tests of different kinds. So here, parental involvement is treated quite generally. So it includes things like the number of books at home, the number of times parents come to parent-teacher meetings, parents being involved in the general life of the school as well as in children's learning. But there's fairly good evidence that the more parents are involved in children's education, the better children tend to do. Okay, so the third reason why out-of-school mathematics seems to be important is that we know mathematics learning and formal understanding of mathematics builds on everyday informal concepts about how the world works. And if children have lots of opportunities to develop these everyday informal concepts, then they've got better materials on which to build more formal mathematics learning. So one example is here, the different ways we think about number. So when we start to develop a formal understanding of number in classrooms in primary schools, we need to be able to think of number in different ways. So sometimes we think of number as a collection of objects, and sometimes, depending on the kind of problem we're trying to solve, it's useful to think of number as a position on a line. So number as a position on a line is really helpful when we're thinking of additions and subtractions, because it's helpful to think of additions as going up the line, helpful to think of subtractions as moving leftwards along the line. And depending on what we're doing with number, sometimes it's useful to think of it as a collection of objects, sometimes as a position on the line. And there's fairly good evidence out there that children having experience of grouping objects together and children having experience of sorting different kinds of objects into orders of different kinds is useful learning experiences that can then be used for them to think about number. So the more experience children have outside of school in grouping objects together based on similar properties, or ordering things on a line, whether that's by number or by any other quality, that those kinds of experiences are likely to feed into into the ease at which they pick up formal understandings about number. And there's all sorts of examples like this. I'm sure understanding different concepts in physics may be easier if children have had experience sitting on a seesaw, for example. It's much easier to understand levers if you have sat on a seesaw, especially with somebody heavier or lighter than you. So quite often formal understandings of concepts build on those kinds of informal understandings of concepts. And the more experience and interactions we've had around those kinds of informal concepts, the easier it is for us to pick up or transfer those to the formal understanding of concepts. Okay, and then finally, schools and teachers can't make the connections between the classroom and home that parents can to harness the value of out-of-school learning. So there's been quite a lot of research showing that children are involved in huge amounts of interesting mathematical thinking and learning outside of school, but that they really struggle to make links between the mathematics they're seeing in their lives outside of school and what they see in the classroom. And the problem for schools and teachers is that children are doing such a huge variety of things outside of school. So in a previous research project with some colleagues, I was looking at what children do outside of school where mathematics thinking and learning might be happening. And so some children are borrowing money to make jewellery to sell at craft fairs. Some children are collecting trading cards and figuring out the value of cards based on their rarity and other qualities. Some children are collaborating with a parent to buy model cars on eBay as investments for their future. Children are doing a huge variety of things, and in any classroom there might be 30 completely different experiences outside of school. It's very difficult for a teacher to make use of in the classroom because not all children are having the same experiences. Whereas parents who are there and do want to support maths learning, they're in an ideal position to help children make these connections, and kind of help children see the value in making connections between the mathematics that they're learning in the classroom and the experiences they're having outside of school in their everyday lives. Okay, moving on to the second main part of this session then, this video. Why do parental engagement interventions often fail? So firstly, I wanted to just give some evidence that they do, because in some ways it seems counterintuitive. It seems like schools are delivering interventions, putting on workshops and things to help parents understand how to support their children doing maths. It seems like that should obviously improve things, improve outcomes for children. But actually the research says that that's not always true. So there's a couple of things. There's this one particular study which I'm mentioning because it's quite a large meta-analysis of other research studies where researchers have tested parental involvement interventions to see if they have positive outcomes for children. So this one, led by Stephen Gorard, reviewed 756 evaluations of parental involvement. 68 of those met criteria that the research team set for design quality, and overall they found no evidence that these interventions improved educational outcomes for children. So this is a quote from their paper saying, overall we found no evidence that primary age interventions to enhance parental involvement are generally effective in increasing children's attainment. In fact, the better studies suggest that interventions can be harmful. Now, looking at the wider literature, we also find this with homework. So there was a review of homework studies by Parental, Cooper and Robinson, I think, that showed that for primary age children, homework in English or homework in language is generally positive for children's progress. Mathematics homework at primary level can quite often have a negative impact on children's learning outcomes. And if you're interested in following up the research on homework, there are some good summaries on the EEF Toolkit website that summarise some of the research, saying that homework, especially in primary schools, can be problematic for children's learning. There seems to be a change somewhere between primary and secondary level. Secondary level, especially around revision for exams, we know that more homework tends to be better for children's learning. But at primary level, more homework is certainly not always a positive thing for children's learning. So why could this be? Our research has shown that this is certainly more complex than just being about one issue. Some issues that we've picked up, and informing our thinking on this, we've carried out lots of interviews and focus groups with large numbers of parents of children between about 4 and 8 years old. And these are some of the issues that come out from this. So one issue is that interventions can often be quite short term. So one of the things that parents typically tell us about is about schools putting on workshops, kind of how to do some area of mathematics. So parents have told us about going to workshops on how schools are teaching some arithmetic operations, for example. And parents have told us that those are useful in the short term because children are learning about these arithmetic operations in class. They're being asked to practice them at home. And then the schools invite parents in, put on a workshop on how these arithmetic operations are being taught in the class and how parents can help children with these at home. But the problem is they work in the short term because children are working on these arithmetic operations for some number of weeks, and then either that helps, so parents can help them, or parents try to help them and it doesn't help. But at some point, children's learning in classrooms moves on, and keeping practicing those same arithmetic operations starts to become no longer helpful. So interventions that are about a particular aspect of mathematics can be attractive in the short term, but are not sustainable, because once children's learning moves on, parents then don't know what to do for that next stage. A second issue is that more of the same may not always be better. So quite a number of these interventions, parents report, similar to the first kind, what I've just mentioned, is that if the parental engagement or parental involvement intervention is about doing more of what children are experiencing in classrooms, then that can sometimes cause difficulties. If children enjoy the mathematics they're doing in class at the moment, then that may be okay if they're being asked by parents to do more of that at home. But if children are finding it very challenging, or if they're not enjoying the mathematics in the classroom, then parents can find that a major struggle to engage children in that learning at home. And parents often report to us that if children are not already engaged in the maths, then it can become quite a kind of source of friction between parents and children when parents are trying to engage children in that same mathematics and the same kinds of activities at home. It can be quite major arguments, and parents talk to us about going and hiding when they know that the child has mathematics homework to do. Now, this is really connected with the third point, that's parents' level of confidence. So there are two aspects to this. Quite often in the literature, we see researchers talking about parents having a lack of confidence in mathematics. But what we found in our own research is partly that. Sometimes parents aren't very confident in mathematics. But what we also found was a lack of confidence in how to teach that mathematics. And this relates to the point I was making just then, is that things are fine. Parents find it okay when children already know how to do the maths. Just getting them to do more practice can sometimes be okay. But then they wonder, is this really helping their learning? If they can already do this, is it really helping? And can I really motivate them to keep doing more of what they're doing in class anyway? But when children can't already do what they're being asked to do, then parents tell us, they might be quite mathematically able. We've spoken to parents who are engineers or nurses and use quite a lot of mathematics in their work, passed O-level or GCSE maths, maybe even have done A-level maths or maths at university. They're very confident, but what they don't have is that pedagogical knowledge of how to help or how to encourage children to take that next step in their learning. Where they don't already know how to do something, parents don't have that confidence in their knowledge of good pedagogy and how to help children learn something they don't already know how to do. So as I say, this can lead to quite a lot of friction at home, and certainly doesn't support children's learning. So the last part of this video is to talk about an alternative approach that we've taken in our research over the last 5 or 6 years or so. And what we've tried to do is kind of avoid some of these barriers and problems that we've seen in other parts of our research. So we know that parents struggle when parental involvement is about replicating or repeating what happens in school and doing the same kinds of things at home with us getting children to complete mathematics problems and worksheets and so on at home that replicates what they're doing at school. That tends not to work. So we need to find an alternative approach. And we need something that avoids the short-term problems of some interventions, where parents are given information and say, do this, and that works for maybe days or weeks, but at some point parents will need more things to do. So we're trying to avoid those two big problems. And so we've started with these 3 principles in mind that are on this slide here. So we're working on the basis that we're going to assume that parents already have the skills they need to support their children's mathematics learning, but they don't always know how important it is to use them. Okay, so we're thinking about this in the same way as children learn all sorts of amazing things without school, right? So children learn to walk, they learn to use the English language, and this is all supported almost 100% by parents or other people at home. So we know parents can support children's learning. So we're going to assume that parents already have the skills they need to support children's learning, but they don't know how important it is to use them, and they're not always confident that this applies to mathematics just as it does to lots of other things that they support. So the second thing is we're building on parents' strengths in supporting their children's learning, and through this approach we hope to address issues around confidence. And then the third thing is we already know there's lots of mathematics in everyday family activity. So I mentioned a few examples earlier, but in the rest of life, organising how we work, how we get things done in the day by organising our time, thinking about organising a family shop at the supermarket, things like budgeting, figuring out where the best place to buy things from because they'll be cheapest, things to do with money in that way, even setting the table. We're thinking about one-to-one correspondence, thinking how many plates do we need, and if we have that many plates, how many sets of cutlery do we need? There's mathematics and opportunities for mathematics talk all over the place in everyday family activity. So we want to start from everyday family activity and work from there. So that already connects. That also connects to that first point. Parents already have the skills they need. So parents are doing a lot of things with their families where there are opportunities for maths talk. So we've had this principle in the development of our approach that we start from there. So what we've done is we initially developed these workshops by working together with groups of parents in a number of schools in Bristol. That started when I was in a previous job working at the University of Bristol. Since that original development with parents, where we ended up with this plan for 4 workshops, I've also worked with lots of different teachers in different parts of the country to adapt these workshops to teachers' own contexts and schools. But essentially, these 3 or 4, and the 4th one's kind of optional and depends on individual teachers' contexts and circumstances and existing relationships with parents and so on. But this plan of 3 or 4 workshops seems to work fairly well in most places, either when we've facilitated these as researchers or where teachers have tried them out in their own schools with groups of parents. And I'll say one more thing here before I describe actually what we've done with families. Is when we did the original research, we were working with parents of Year 3 children, and we found that the workshops worked well. But when we started working with teachers to deliver these workshops in their own schools, teachers started telling us that these actually are likely to work a lot better with parents of younger children. And now lots of teachers that we've worked with since have been using these workshops with reception families. And partly what that does is get good habits started early, but it also develops good relationships with families and parents from that very early stage of children's school life. So we know these have worked well for Year 7 and 8 children, but they seem to work even better for younger children. And that also aligns with the research that I mentioned earlier on Maths Talk. A lot of that has been done with younger children. So getting high levels of Maths Talk is probably likely to be more effective, more supportive of children's learning if they are a bit younger too. So this is a really good thing to introduce even in the early years. So this is what we've done with families. It works really well with groups, so much better with groups of parents rather than working one-to-one. Because what works really well is parents sharing their experiences. And that also really helps with treating the parents as the experts and developing their own ways of working here. It's really important, the ideas of how to find the maths in everyday life and how to share that with children come from the groups of parents rather than from the teacher. That really sets up the sustainability of this as an intervention. So in the first workshop, we really try not to talk about mathematics too much. It's really setting the context of there being a lot of activity in families' everyday lives. So in the first workshop, we're really just interested in getting families talking about what they do outside of school. What do they do once children have been picked up from school and they go home? What are the things they do? What are the things that families are doing at the weekend? So first of all, this is a really non-threatening kind of conversation for parents to be having. It's quite nice for them to come to a workshop on parental engagement in mathematics and not dive straight into chunking or how to do long multiplication. It's also really useful for teachers to find out, what a family's doing. As I said earlier, quite a lot of the time we use examples of everyday kind of practices to support our introduction of mathematical concepts in classrooms. So it's really helpful to know what families are actually doing so that we can build on them. And through this project, teachers have told us about quite a number of occasions where they've found actually they've been using examples in the classroom that just haven't made sense in hindsight to the children that they're working with. So one teacher that we worked with in Bristol told us about an afternoon when he'd been introducing ideas around probability and chance to his children, to the children in his classroom, with getting them to use dice. And then set them a task to do, to take home and to try it with their parents, and said, okay, so for this you'll need to make sure you find a dice at home so you can do this at home. And lots of the children put their hand up and said, we don't have a dice at home. And the teacher couldn't believe this and said, okay, well, I'll talk to your parents at the end of the day. And waited to pick up time and spoke to all the parents and said, I've got this task for your children to do, they'll need a dice at home. And it turned out they didn't have dice at home. So the teacher had in mind, I'll use dice as the example, because this will be building on what children are familiar with outside of school, and only realised after the fact that this wasn't something that children had been familiar with at all. So this is really helpful just as teachers to help us think about what are we building on, what experiences are we building on, and what examples make sense for us to use in the classroom. Are we actually using examples in the classroom that are part of children's lives? So at the end of that first workshop, we start to bring in the mathematics. So these workshops are around 90 minutes long. And at the end of the first hour of workshop one, we'll start to bring in some mathematics. So we'll take one of those examples of family activity and just pose the question. You wouldn't normally talk about mathematics when you're doing this activity together as a family, but if you did, what would that look like? And then what we found works really well, but can be quite challenging in the moment, is to then not say anything and really wait for the parents to say something themselves. And it's one of those questions where you can wait for what seems like a very long time for an answer, but an answer always comes along. So in one of the schools we worked with in Bristol, lots of families had been to the zoo. That was a really common activity that parents talked about in that particular group. So that was the example we used when we set that question. And we said, so you wouldn't normally talk about mathematics when you went to the zoo, but if you did, what would that look like? And it did seem like a long time before we got an answer. But the reason why I think this is really key, that the teacher or the facilitator doesn't give the answer for this kind of question straight away, is parents need to see for themselves that they've got the answers, and they don't need to be told what to do by the teacher in this case. So it was a while, but then one of the parents said, well, you could count the number of animals in each of the enclosures. Okay, so then our job as the facilitators of this workshop was to say, yes, that's a great idea. Does anyone else have something else? And another parent talked about the fact that when you visit the zoo, you quite often get a map. You get a leaflet with a map of the zoo, and you can talk to children looking at the map about how you're going to work your way around. Which bits do you want to see first? How are you going to make sure you see everything that you want to using this map? So again, we say, great. Has anyone got any other examples? And then you'll find once some parents start talking, more ideas will come. So some parents were talking about, you have a budget for the day, and you can talk to the children about how you make that the amount of money that you've got last the whole day. So there's ice creams, there's lunch, there's gift shop, and it can't all be spent everywhere. And then some parents brought up some more complex mathematical ideas. So the animals have different needs and they live in different ways. So you get different kind of population densities in cages. So you have one huge big enclosure for 2 tigers, but then quite a small tank for what seems like hundreds of locusts. And so talking about population density starts to bring multiple variables in together. So in every example that we've had in working with parents in lots of different schools in this first workshop, it always seems like a risk to get that first conversation going about finding the mathematics in everyday activity. But we always get this flow of ideas. Once it starts, then parents realise they're doing this all the time. They can find the mathematics themselves. And certainly having parents as a group able to bounce ideas off each other really seems to help here. So workshop 2 is about developing that further. So between workshop 1 and workshop 2, we ask parents to be aware of the kinds of activities they're doing and maybe to bring in 1 or 2 more examples. In workshop 2, what we've tended to do is get big sheets of flip chart paper and post-it notes, this kind of thing, and then pick an activity that they do regularly and do this. How many things can they think of where there are opportunities to talk about mathematics around an activity? So we've had lots of nice examples there. And again, parents are really very good at coming up with examples after we've had that first workshop. And even things, I remember one example was something as simple as going for a walk. So it was a father was talking about going for a walk at the weekend, and they'd walked up a hill and found a rope swing. And they were talking about all sorts of opportunities where they could have talked about mathematics but didn't in this second workshop. So things like thinking about the gradient of the hill and how it was much quicker to walk home again than it was to walk to the top of the hill in the first place. They talked about there was a tower at the top of this hill, and they were talking about how you could estimate the height of the tower. They needed to be back to meet some people for lunch after this walk, so they were talking about managing time. So again, once parents have the idea of this finding mathematics in everyday activity, the ideas always continue to flow, and parents are really very good at coming up with lots of ideas. But workshop 2 is really about finding the mathematics in everyday activity and showing that this is possible for all sorts of different activities. Then between workshop 2 and 3, we asked parents to start thinking about ways to share this with children. So now parents have become aware of all these opportunities to think about the mathematics in everyday life. How do they then start to share that with children? So we've really built up to this. This is we've tended to run these workshops weekly or fortnightly. So parents have had quite a bit of time to come to understand about the quantity of mathematical opportunities in everyday life before we ask them to do anything with their children. So now we're asking them to just think about ways they could share this thinking and learning with children. maybe try some things out. And then in workshop 3, we ask them just to share what those experiences have been like. What seems to have worked, what's been more challenging. And what's interesting is in every time we've run these workshops in schools, and every time that teachers have run these workshops for themselves in schools, parents come back with the same kinds of things. So it's, again, we know parents can do this. It's just about developing the confidence in what they're doing. So parents always then tell us this is about, asking the right questions. And these are not parents' words, these are my words, but about lowering the stakes. So I'm going to add to this in a little bit, but lowering the stakes, because this is a big problem with parents' normal experience of supporting mathematics outside of school, is that parents feel like they have a particular job to do with maths, is to get from a problem to the right answer. And that becomes a high stakes situation, because if they can get to that answer with their child in a conversation, they feel like they've succeeded, but they feel like there's lots of ways to fail with a mathematical conversation. So what this approach and the approach I'm talking about here with these workshops, it's about supporting parents to realise that that's something that you can do in supporting maths, is focus on problems and get to answers, but just having a conversation that involves noticing mathematical concepts in the world or involves use of mathematical language about things in the world is as useful for children's learning than working through a page of mathematical problems. And this is the thing that we can't do in classrooms. This is a way for parental engagement to really complement what's happening in classrooms. It really connects children's learning with their everyday life and gives them opportunity to use mathematical language in all sorts of ways connected to their everyday life that we're not able to do as teachers in classrooms. So the workshops have tended to really bring out for us what some of the barriers are to parents thinking about how they can support their children's mathematics learning, but they also provide us a way of showing parents how to avoid these barriers in supporting their children's learning. So I've already mentioned some of these, but I just want to flesh them out a little bit. So a big problem for parents is that they think maths at home needs to look like maths at school, and they're not confident about what maths at school looks like or in their ability to replicate that. So we get quotes like this from parents. So this is a parent telling us, I guess the problem is I'm always thinking, well, how am I going to reinforce the stuff they're doing at school? How do I make that relevant? Because actually it's not. So it's almost like you're arguing for a different maths course right at that point. You wish the children did the maths that was relevant to the world, rather than trying to make the world relevant to the maths they're doing in school. So this is how some parents are thinking about this. And actually it's about showing that both of those things are useful things to do. Not everything that children are experiencing in mathematics classes is going to make sense for them in application to the real world straight away. And we're not always learning mathematics in classrooms because it should have application to the real world straight away. There is definitely value in the more abstract mathematics that we learn and that we're asking children to learn. Not necessarily always in its immediate application to children's real world problems, but children's mathematical thinking about how they're dealing with the real world is also important. And this is a role that parents can really play that complements what we're doing in classrooms. And we know from the research that just more quantity and more quality of mathematical language outside of school is helpful in its own right. So the second thing that we really picked up on was that parents feel that if they're doing maths at home, then it needs to respect curriculum boundaries. So they kind of told us things when they were coming up with examples of mathematics in everyday life. They often asked these questions. So is that okay as an example? Because that might be science. So there was one nice example of a mother talking about how at the end of the day, if it was the end of the week, they'd have a box of biscuits, and the child would be able to pick a biscuit at the end of the day, at the end of the school day when they got home, and sit and have a biscuit. And they just tried out saying, so how did you choose that one? See if that was an opportunity for some mathematical thinking. And it turns out that's a very good opportunity for some mathematical thinking. And it's really interesting to see what answers come back, because once one parent tried this, others tried it. And I think sometimes it was with biscuits, sometimes it was with other treats. But you get answers back like, I chose that one because it's the biggest, or it's the heaviest, or it's got the biggest proportion of chocolate. And one interesting answer was a child said, I haven't seen those ones in the books before, and it might not be there when I get to have another one. So there we've got things around supply and demand, and parents were saying, well, is that okay? Is that really maths? Because that seems like it might be more economics. And this is a really good opportunity in this, if you're running these workshops, to say it doesn't really matter. Sometimes curriculum boundaries matter if we're preparing for exams or thinking about developing the curriculum in our teaching in school. But at home, you don't really need to worry about these things. It's fine for mathematics to happen in the context of economics or science or history and geography. Using mathematical language is a good thing, whatever you're talking about. I've mentioned this one already, all mathematics activities need to end up with the right answer. And this can be really problematic. So we get things like this, a parent talking about a rope swing, a child on a rope swing. So the parent vaguely remembered a law of physics about pendulums, and they were trying to talk to their daughter about this law about pendulums, and they'd misremembered it. So I think the law of physics they were thinking about, or the law of pendulums, was the time it takes for a pendulum to swing is proportional to the length of the pendulum, and it doesn't matter how quickly or slowly it's going, the length of time it takes to swing from one side to the other is always the same. But they'd misremembered this rule, and they thought that it should always swing to the same height on the other side. And obviously it doesn't, because you've got air resistance and so on. And so because they'd misremembered, the conversation ground to a halt, because they knew at an early stage in this conversation they weren't going to end up at this right answer, because the parent had set off at the beginning of this conversation thinking, right, we'll talk about this pendulum, we'll talk about a rope swing as a pendulum, and we will end up with my child understanding this law of pendulums. And when it became clear to the parent that wasn't going to happen, because they suddenly realised they weren't confident and they'd forgotten that law that they'd learned in school, the conversation ground to a halt. So that allowed us to think about, so how else? How could you have approached this? Maybe just holding the rope swing out to one side and saying to the child, so what's going to happen when I let this go? That in itself will lead to some conversation and some potential mathematical thinking and learning. So these are the key things. It's about lowering the stakes. If you don't always have to get to a correct answer, then a question or a prompt from a parent can lead to some mathematical talk, or maybe it goes nowhere. But nobody's lost out if you don't end up at a right answer. And it doesn't always have to be sensible things. We've had some really nice responses from children that involve lots of mathematical thinking. So things like asking children at meal times, so if you really had to, how many sausages could you eat in 24 hours? It doesn't have to go anywhere, but if it does, then some mathematical thinking and learning will have happened. And these are some responses from parents around the third or fourth workshop when we've run those. It's about knowing the right questions to ask rather than the right things to say. So it's not about giving children the knowledge necessarily, it's about encouraging them to think about and use mathematical language in thinking about the everyday activities that they're doing. And this is another thing that parents have opportunities to do that we don't always have in the classroom. So parents have talked to us that this is like planting the seed. You can plant an idea there and just say, share with the child that you're interested in these kinds of things. You're interested in what children's thinking is about these situations, how children make decisions about what they're going to do in the world. And then allowing children's responses to take time. So parents talk to us quite a lot after they've participated in these workshops. They might ask a question and not get an immediate response. But rather than give the answer themselves, they would just leave that for a while. And then later in the day, a child would come back and give a response because they'd been thinking about it during that time. Now, we can't always let thinking and learning take a long time in classrooms because we've got a curriculum to get through. But at home, it can very much be about planting the seed by asking a question. So how did you make that decision? Or what do you think we should do here? And letting children take their time to think about that situation and think about what that response is. And this is something that's really helpful for parents to pick up on, that we don't always have to be in a rush in prompting this. Okay, I planned for 40 minutes. It's gone over a bit. So thanks very much to anyone who's still with me there. I hope that's been useful. As I say, feel free to get in touch if this is an area you're interested in. It's something that we may well be doing some more work on, or CPD sessions through LUMEN. It's not the easiest way to improve children's learning by doing something new in your classroom. But for me, the investment in parental engagement is worth it. Certainly, we found parents don't know how important they are to their children's learning. And if we can get parents interested in learning and children's education more generally, it can have huge benefits, I think. So I'll stop there, and thanks very much for watching.